defense rests, let's lay it down. Gonna dig deep, wave that verdict round. The defense rests, time to analyze. With the evidence, we'll unveil the crime. Justice served in an honest fight, true crime tales till the verdict's right. Solving more than just trivial quests, where sentences rule at the defense rests.
So you would need multiple similar.
Previously, one Dr. Rebecca Dietrich,
Her assistant, who would have accompanied me at the time as well.
Now, the procedure that you previously discussed about how you review information and then you start with the outside examination and then you do the internal examination, is that how you performed this particular autopsy on
Yes.
January 30th?
Yes, it was.
And once you finish your autopsy, do you create a report of the autopsy?
I do.
And is that the document that you're referencing right now?
I have both the body diagram and also the report of autopsy in front of me. Yes.
So could you please tell the court, did you observe any injuries to the body of Andrew Savitz on January 30th of 2020?
I did.
And what did you notice?
He had an ecchymosis or a bruise surrounding his left eye. He also had lacerations of the oral mucosa, which means just the inside of his lip. He had an abrasion on his back, and he had abrasions on his right arm and left leg. And by abrasion, I mean a scrape.
And were you able to tell how old any of those injuries were?
No.
And why not?
It's difficult to date injuries unless you have multiple similar injuries on a decedent, and then you can kind of place them in a timeline. For example, if someone had 3 different bruises, one of them was more purple and one was more green, you would know that the one that was green was older. However, you couldn't say the green one was from a week ago and the blue one was from an hour ago. So you would need multiple similar injuries in order to date them like that.
And once you make your observations of the injuries to Mr. Savitz, did you record them in your report?
I did.
Now, Dr. Dietrich, were you able to refer to any medical records prior to conducting this autopsy?
Before I was completed with my death certificate, my autopsy report, yes. I do not know if I had all of the medical records before the actual exam. Those often come in throughout the day, or even up to days and weeks after.
And what medical records did you have with regards to Mr. Savitz before you had completed your death certificate?
I had emergency room records from Beth Israel.
And did you have any other information pertaining to Mr. Savitz prior to completing the death certificate?
I did.
What else did you have?
I had the Brookline Police Department report, and I had the Massachusetts State Police report as well.
Now, what information, if any, did you learn from the police reports and the medical records that you factored into completing your death certificate?
There were multiple pieces of information. One that was taken from the police reports was the timeline of when he was seen to collapse. There was information relayed to me, again, in those 2 reports, that there had been some sort of argument between Mr. Savitz and I believe his ex-wife that was reported by their daughter to 911. He was witness to collapse during that argument. And so that was one piece of information that led to my conclusions. The other piece was the Beth Israel records indicated that he had EKG changes that were consistent with what is called a STEMI, which is an ST elevation myocardial infarction. It's a type of heart attack. So those two pieces of information were key to my decisions.
Now, once you completed the external examination, did you then move on to perform an internal examination?
I did.
And what did you observe during your internal examination?
Mr. Savitz had quite a bit of cardiac disease. Specifically, his heart was enlarged. He had changes to the valves in his heart. So his aortic valve was calcified. His mitral and tricuspid valves were thickened. He also had severe calcification or stenosis of his left anterior descending coronary artery and his right coronary artery, up to about 90% occlusion. So those are two of the three main cardiac coronary arteries. And he also had moderate, up to 60% stenosis of his left circumflex coronary artery. He also had moderate atherosclerosis of his aorta. He had severe atherosclerosis of the vasculature to his brain. He also had an old infarct in his brain, which again is consistent with that cardiac disease. And he had what we call nephrosclerosis, which is kidney damage, again indicative of continuous high blood pressure, hypertension. Again, that fits together. He also had evidence of diabetes, which was also recorded in his medical record. His pancreas was fibrotic, meaning that his pancreas did not function the way it was supposed to. And I neglected to mention on the external examination, he also had what is known as a continuous glucose monitor, which is again a device that is often used in patients who are diabetic.
Now, doctor, just going back to your cardiac findings, can you explain what the coronary arteries are?
Of course. There are, like I said, three main coronary arteries. So there's the left anterior descending, the left circumflex, and the right coronary artery. Those are the blood supply to the heart itself. So they provide blood flow to the heart to enable it to function.
And when you say a severe 90% stenosis of the left anterior descending and right coronary arteries, can you explain what you mean by that? What is a stenosis?
Stenosis means that it's small. So if you picture it like a pipe, for lack of a better analogy, it would be as though a pipe was blocked so that only 10% of the flow could go through that pipe.
And then when you say the left circumflex coronary artery, which artery is that?
It wraps around the left side of the heart. It's another one of the coronary arteries.
And what is the aorta?
The aorta is the main artery throughout the body that provides blood flow to the rest of the body from the heart. So to the organs, to the limbs, etc.
Now, Dr. Diedrich, the external injuries that you described, could any of those external injuries have caused Mr. Savitz's death?
By themselves, no.
Once you were able to conduct your external examination, your internal examination, and you had reviewed all of the provided documentation from both the police departments and the hospital, were you able to form an opinion as to the cause of death?
Yes.
And what was your opinion?
I signed out the cause of death as cardiac dysrhythmia following an altercation in a person with hypertensive and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease and diabetes mellitus.
Could you please explain for the court, what does that cause of death mean?
You can break it down into three components. So cardiac dysrhythmia means that the heart misfired. Other people might use the terms cardiac arrhythmia or cardiac arrest or cardiopulmonary arrest, but it means that his heart misfired in such a way that his heart was not functioning correctly. The second piece, so following an altercation, means that he, again, had a witnessed argument and immediately collapsed during or immediately following that argument. And then the third piece, a person with hypertensive and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease and diabetes mellitus is referencing that natural disease that was both in the medical record and also seen at the time of autopsy.
Now, you had indicated before that the timing was an important factor in determining your cause of death. Can you explain what about that timing led you to reach this opinion?
Yes. So NAME, the National Guiding Organization for Medical Examiners, set out guidelines for how to certify deaths. One of the critical components for cases such as this one is that for a person who is in a kind of a heightened emotional situation, whether that's an argument or an altercation or something similar, if they are witnessed to collapse or have an arrhythmia either during that event or immediately after, you cannot ignore that temporality, that timeline.
And so were you able to form an opinion based on that information and your observations as to what the manner of death is?
Objection.
For the reasons stated?
Yes.
So I'm going to allow it subject to, after I hear it,
Were you able to form an opinion as to the manner of death?
Yes, I did.
And what was that opinion?
Homicide.
And can you explain what homicide means according to the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner?
In this situation, homicide is a medical definition, which means death at the hands of another.
And do the NAME guidelines instruct that homicide is an appropriate manner of death in a situation where there is an argument and a close in time death following it?
Yes, they do.
Dr. Diedrich, with regards to what you read in the documentation, the police reports, and what you observed about Mr. Savitz during the autopsy, were you able to form an opinion as to who caused Mr. Savitz's death?
Objection.
that's the statement.
In your medical opinion, would Mr. Savitz have died at that time if not for the argument that had ensued?
Objection.
For the reasons that I'm stating. Which is.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, he would not have passed away if not for the circumstances of that day.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
Dr. Diedrich, I'm showing you exhibit number 2. Do you recognize this document?
I do, yes.
What is it?
This is a representation, a copy of the death certificate that I signed for this case.
Now, when did you sign this document?
April 24th of 2020.
And Ms. Crawford, could we please see exhibit number 2? Now, Dr. Diedrich, could you just explain for the court the process of certifying a death certificate?
So often at the time of an autopsy, as we have discussed before, the medical examiner is waiting for additional information. So a death certificate generated on the day of an autopsy is marked as manner pending and cause of death pending. As more information comes out, the final cause and manner of death are then determined. The way that it works at my office, at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the Commonwealth, I then fill out an amendment sheet, either digitally or handwritten. It is then given to an administrative assistant who updates the information in the vital records system, the online system. I then go into the online system and digitally sign the death certificate.
So in this particular case, it was almost 4 months later, correct?
Yes.
And is that an unusual time frame or length of time to have a pending certificate turn into a final?
No, the name guidelines would like 90% of death certificates signed out by 90 days. But for cases that involve more components, this is not outside the realm of what is considered normal.
And so the name guidelines speak to the procedure of certifying the death certificate?
Yes.
I'm going to have to object to my husband's side.
They're taking a sidebar there. Let's bring in our guest who is standing by, joining us from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, criminal defense attorney and former district attorney Matthew Mangino. Matthew, this witness on the stand said something really important for both sides. She said that without the physical argument turned into an altercation, that the bad heart of this victim would not have killed him. But also she said that without the external injuries, that just those external injuries, he wouldn't have died. Those weren't enough to kill him. What are you left with when you hear this very important witness on the stand?
Well, I think Dr. Dietrich was a very compelling witness, or is a very compelling witness, as she is still testifying. I think when she said, but for this altercation, the victim would not have died. I think that is extremely important here, because we're talking about manslaughter, and this isn't an intentional killing; it's an unintentional killing. But based on his severe cardiovascular disease, and the fact that he was involved in this argument, and she said you can't set aside the time frame here. It's important to understand when he collapsed, and he was in the midst of an argument, a heated argument, and therefore the defendant in this case is responsible for his death.
Yeah, so it was really compelling testimony, to say the least. Welcome to Vinnie Politan Investigates. I'm Julia Janae, filling in for Vinnie Politan. The subject of our investigation is the death of Massachusetts father who
Justice served in an honest fight. True crime tales till the verdict's right. Solving more than just trivial quests, where sentences rule at the defense rests. Justice served in an honest fight. True crime tales till the verdict's right. Solving more than just trivial quests, where sentences rule and the defense rests.